In the United Kingdom, there are currently 2,500 unresolved missing persons cases where the individual was last seen within 5 miles of their own home. Not abroad, not in another city, within 5 miles of where they lived. Of those cases, forensic investigators estimate that a significant proportion involve what the National Crime Agency formally classifies as proximate concealment, the burial, storage, or deliberate hiding of human remains in locations so ordinary, so close to the victim's daily life, that they are statistically the last places anyone thinks to look. A garden shed, a cellar, a loft, a back garden. According to data compiled by the Home Office and published in the 2022 Missing Persons Framework Review, the average time between the disappearance of a victim whose remains were later found in a domestic location and the discovery of those remains was 4 years and 3 months. 4 years, on average. In the case we are examining today, it was 3 years, 1 month, and 11 days. The discovery was not made by police. It was not made by forensic investigators following a lead. It was not the result of a tip-off, a DNA match, or a surveillance operation. It was made by a father, in his own garden, on a Sunday afternoon in March. And what he found there, what had been buried 14 inches below the surface of a flower bed he had tended every summer for 22 years, would destroy everything he thought he knew about the person he had raised. His name was Gerald, 64 years old, a retired civil engineer from a market town in Shropshire. He had lived in the same semi-detached house since 1989. He knew every inch of that garden, the rose bed along the eastern fence, the vegetable patch he'd built himself, the apple tree his wife had planted before she passed. On the morning of the 9th of March 2021, Gerald decided to turn the soil in the flower bed along the rear fence. Early spring. He did it every year. He'd done it 22 times before. He knew exactly how the ground should look, how it should feel, how deep the roots of the winter plants would have taken. The soil was wrong. He couldn't have explained it precisely in that first moment. It was just wrong. Looser than it should have been, darker. A slightly different texture along a section roughly 2 feet wide, running parallel to the fence. He pushed his spade in, and then he stopped, because the smell that rose from the ground in that moment was not the smell of earth. Gerald went inside his house. He sat down at the kitchen table. He did not call the police immediately. He sat there for 45 minutes. Because to call the police, he would have to say what he suspected. And to say what he suspected, he would have to say his son's name. Before we go any further, I want you to hold one question in your mind, not about the victim, not about Gerald, about his son. His son had access to that garden. His son had a key to that house. His son had been present, visibly, normally, unremarkably present, every Christmas, every birthday, every Sunday lunch for 3 years after that body went into the ground. He sat at that kitchen table. He passed his father the salt. He asked about the garden. How does a person do that? That question is what this entire case is built around. Stay with me. When Shropshire police arrived at Gerald's address at approximately 2:15 p.m. on the 9th of March 2021, their initial working assumption was straightforward. An elderly man, recently widowed, believed he had found something unusual in his garden. Possible animal remains. Possible historic burial, not uncommon in properties of that age in rural Shropshire. The first officer on scene, a uniformed constable, 3 years in service, later told the inquest that he had expected to find something small. A pet, maybe. Or nothing at all. What the scene examiner found, 40 minutes later, was a human femur. And then a pelvis. And then, carefully, methodically, over the next 6 hours, the rest of a complete human skeleton, wrapped in a black polyethylene tarpaulin, bound with cable ties, buried at a depth of approximately 14 inches in a flower bed that had been replanted, deliberately, precisely, over the top of it. Someone had planted flowers over a grave, in a garden they knew would be tended, in a garden they visited regularly, in a garden that belonged to their father. The initial theory from the senior investigating officer, Detective Chief Inspector Rachel Farrow of West Mercia Police Major Investigation Team, was that this was a historic crime, possibly decades old, possibly unconnected to the current occupants of the property. That theory lasted precisely 4 days. The forensic pathologist assigned to the case, Dr. Miriam Osei of the West Midlands Forensic Pathology Unit, submitted her preliminary report on the 13th of March 2021. The skeleton was female, age estimated between 28 and 35 at time of death, height approximately 5 feet 4 inches, No identification on the remains. No jewelry. No clothing. The tarpaulin had preserved the bones in an unusually complete state. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the posterior cranium. Multiple impacts. The pathologist's report described the injury pattern as consistent with repeated strikes from a single blunt instrument with a rounded or cylindrical profile. But here is the detail that stopped DCI Farrow cold. The bones showed no sign of the degradation consistent with a burial of more than 5 to 7 years. The soil chemistry, the state of the tarpaulin, the condition of the cable ties, all of it pointed to a burial date of between 2 and 4 years prior to discovery. In other words, this body had been placed in that garden sometime between 2017 and 2019. Gerald had moved into that house in 1989. His son, Thomas, then 38 years old, an IT project manager from Telford, had last lived at the property full-time in 2009 when he moved into a flat 12 miles away. But between 2017 and 2019, Thomas had visited his father regularly, had helped with the garden on multiple occasions, had, according to Gerald's own statement, done the digging for the new flower bed along the back fence in the summer of 2018. Gerald had asked him to do it, as a favor, because his back was bad that year. Thomas had told him, "Don't worry, Dad, I'll handle it." DCI Farrow requested a DNA comparison between the skeletal remains and the missing persons database on the 14th of March 2021. The National DNA Database returned a familial match, not a direct identification, but a partial match suggesting the victim was related to an individual already on the system. That individual was a woman named Kayla Mathers, 29 years old, reported missing by her mother in November 2018 from her flat in Telford, Shropshire. Kayla had been Thomas's girlfriend. She had been reported missing 17 months before Gerald found her remains in his garden. And in those 17 months during which Kayla's mother had been calling the police, updating the missing persons report, putting up posters, speaking to local newspapers, Thomas had been interviewed by police twice as part of the missing persons investigation. He had told them he and Kayla had separated in October 2018, that she had seemed unsettled, that he had no idea where she might have gone. Both times he had been released without further action. But this is where the case takes a turn that nobody in the investigation anticipated. Detective Chief Inspector Farrow and her team at West Mercia Police Major Investigation Team spent the next 3 weeks conducting what the senior Crown prosecutor later described as one of the most methodical and forensically rigorous investigations this office has seen at regional level. They began with the physical evidence. The tarpaulin, a standard black polyethylene ground cover, available at any DIY retailer, had been heat-sealed at both ends, a detail the forensic examiner described as consistent with deliberate, premeditated preparation rather than opportunistic concealment. The cable ties were a brand stocked exclusively, at the time of estimated burial, at a single trade supplier in Telford. Purchase records subpoenaed from that supplier showed a cash purchase of 12 cable ties and 1 roll of polyethylene sheeting on the 17th of August 2018. No name. Cash transaction. CCTV from the store had been overwritten. But the store's car park CCTV had not. A partial plate match, 2 confirmed characters, 1 probable, pointed to a vehicle registered to a hire company in Telford. The hire company's records showed the vehicle had been rented on the 17th of August 2018. The name on the hire agreement, Thomas Gerald Hartley. Thomas had rented a van on the same day someone bought a tarpaulin and cable ties in cash from a trade supplier 400 meters away. The van hire record showed the vehicle was returned the following morning. The mileage logged during that rental, 31 miles. The distance from Thomas's flat in Telford to Gerald's house in Shropshire, 12 miles each way. 24 miles for a return journey, 7 miles unaccounted for. Those 7 miles would take investigators another 6 weeks to explain. The forensic anthropology report, submitted by Dr. Osei in full on the 2nd of April 2021, made 3 findings that the prosecution would later describe as the spine of their case. First, the wound pattern on the posterior cranium was consistent with a cylindrical metal object approximately 28 to 35 millimeters in diameter, a pipe, a bar, or, as the pathologist noted specifically, a torque wrench of the type used in construction and engineering work. Thomas worked in IT, but his father was a retired civil engineer, and in Gerald's garage, in a tool chest that had not been opened, by Gerald's own account, since his retirement in 2017, there was a set of torque wrenches. One was missing. Gerald had not noticed. He had not been in the garage regularly since his wife died. Second, the soil samples taken from the tarpaulin's interior showed trace contamination with a specific phosphate-based compound used in garden fertilizer. The brand was identifiable. It was the same brand Gerald kept in his garden shed. The same brand Thomas would have had access to when he handled the flower bed in the summer of 2018. Third, and this is the finding that the defense team spent 4 days attempting to discredit, microscopic fiber analysis of the tarpaulin's inner surface recovered 17 individual fibers consistent with the carpet type installed in Thomas's flat in Telford. The carpet manufacturer confirmed the dye batch was specific to a production run sold to a single flooring contractor operating in the Telford area between 2015 and 2019. 17 fibers, in a sealed tarpaulin, in a garden 12 miles away. The forensic examiner's conclusion: the aggregate physical evidence is consistent with the victim having been transported in the tarpaulin from an interior location carpeted with the identified material. In plain English, Kayla had been wrapped in that tarpaulin inside Thomas's flat. Here is the question that was raised, quietly, carefully, and with significant institutional discomfort, during the pretrial review. When Kayla Mathers was reported missing in November 2018, Shropshire police conducted a standard missing persons investigation. Thomas was interviewed. His flat was not searched. His vehicle records were not subpoenaed. His phone was not examined. The investigation was classified as a voluntary missing adult case within 72 hours of the initial report. This classification, standard procedure for adults with no evidence of third-party involvement, effectively reduced the active investigative resource allocated to the case. Kayla's mother, Sandra Mathers, had told the reporting officer at the time, she wouldn't just leave. She was scared of him. She told me she was scared of him. That statement was recorded in the case file. It did not change the classification. When DCI Farrow reviewed the original missing persons file in March 2021, she found Sandra Mathers' statement on page 4 of the initial report. She found no evidence that it had been actioned. No follow-up interview with Sandra. No risk assessment conducted under the DASH framework, the domestic abuse, stalking, and honor-based violence risk identification tool that officers are required to complete when a missing person report contains an allegation of fear relating to a named individual. The DASH form had not been completed. At the inquest into Kayla's death, the officer who took the original report, by then transferred to a different force, stated that he did not recall Sandra Mathers making the statement about fear. The written record showed otherwise. The Independent Office for Police Conduct opened an investigation into the handling of the original missing persons report in September 2021. The outcome of that investigation has not, at the time of this video's publication, been made public. Kayla Mathers was not the first woman in England and Wales to be reported missing in circumstances that involved an allegation of fear relating to a named male partner and to have that allegation go unactioned. She will not be the last. In 2021, the Femicide Census, an independent organization that documents the killing of women by men in the United Kingdom, published its annual report. It found that in 61% of cases where a woman was subsequently killed by a male partner or ex-partner, there had been at least one prior police contact related to the relationship. In 38% of those cases, a specific allegation of fear or threat had been recorded and not escalated. 38%. Following Kayla's case and several others, the National Police Chiefs Council issued updated guidance on missing persons investigations involving domestic abuse indicators. The guidance now requires mandatory DASH completion within 24 hours of any missing persons report containing a named individual and an allegation of fear. The guidance was issued in January 2023, 4 years after Kayla disappeared, 2 years after her remains were found in a flower bed in Shropshire. Sandra Mathers gave evidence at the inquest. She described calling the missing persons unit 17 times over the course of 2019. She described being told, on multiple occasions, that Kayla was an adult who had chosen to leave. She described the moment she received the phone call from DCI Farrow in March 2021. She said, "I knew, from the day she went missing, I knew, I told them, and they wrote it down and did nothing with it." Thomas Hartley had, by all visible accounts, lived a normal life for 3 years after Kayla's death. He had attended his father's 62nd birthday dinner in September 2018, 6 weeks after the burial. He had spent Christmas 2018 at Gerald's house. He had walked in that garden on Christmas morning with his father. He had stood within 20 feet of where Kayla was buried and commented, according to Gerald's statement, that the new flower bed was coming along nicely. He had sent his father a text message in April 2019 asking whether the daffodils had come up well that year. Gerald had replied, "Beautiful, best year yet." He didn't know. That is the part of this case that Gerald has spoken about in the only public statement he has made since the trial concluded. He said, "I tended that garden for 3 years not knowing what was in it. I watered those flowers. I was proud of them. He knew what was under there and he asked me how they looked." Gerald did not attend the trial. He gave his evidence via video link. He has not returned to the house since March 2021. Thomas was arrested on the 6th of April 2021 at his flat in Telford. He was cooperative at the point of arrest. He said nothing. In an interview conducted over 2 days by DCI Farrow and DS James Whitmore, Thomas maintained a consistent position. He had nothing to do with Kayla's disappearance or death. He accepted that he had rented a van on the 17th of August 2018. He said he couldn't remember what he had used it for. He accepted that the cable ties and tarpaulin had been purchased near his flat. He said he had no knowledge of that purchase. He had an answer for everything. A thin one, but an answer. And then the Crown Prosecution Service disclosed the phone evidence. Thomas's mobile phone had been examined under a digital forensic warrant. The cell site analysis, tracking which mobile phone mast his handset had connected to over the course of August 2018, placed him at Gerald's property in Shropshire at 11:47 p.m. on the 17th of August 2018. He had not mentioned visiting his father that night in either of his 2 previous witness interviews. When DCI Farrow put this to him in the 3rd interview, placing the cell site map on the table and asking him to explain, Thomas was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I want to speak to my solicitor." He did not speak again during the police investigation. The trial of Thomas Gerald Hartley opened at Shrewsbury Crown Court on the 14th of February 2022. The defense case, led by a senior QC retained by Thomas's legal team, rested on a single central argument. The physical evidence was consistent with Thomas having assisted in the disposal of Kayla's body, but not with him having caused her death. The defense argued that Kayla had died accidentally, that Thomas had panicked, that the concealment, while criminal, was not evidence of murder. It was a careful argument, a credible argument, and for approximately 3 days of the trial, it appeared to be gaining traction with the jury. And then the prosecution called its final witness. A woman named Claire, Kayla's closest friend, a woman who had not been interviewed by police during the original missing persons investigation because no one had asked for a list of Kayla's friends, because the case had been classified as voluntary missing before that basic investigative step had been taken. Claire had reached out to the prosecution team after reading about the trial in the Shropshire Star. She told the court that in September 2018, 1 month after the estimated date of Kayla's death, she had received a voicemail from Kayla's phone number. She had saved it. She had not known what to do with it. She had been too frightened to go to the police. She played it in court. It was Thomas's voice, using Kayla's phone, calling Claire, telling her that Kayla had decided to move away and asking Claire not to make things difficult. He had used a dead woman's phone to manage her social network. The jury deliberated for 11 hours and 40 minutes. On the 4th of March 2022, Thomas Gerald Hartley was found guilty of murder. The jury returned a unanimous verdict. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 26 years. He showed no reaction at the point of sentencing. Gerald was watching via video link. He made no public statement that day. The judge, His Honor Judge Anthony Marsh, addressed Thomas directly before passing sentence. He said the following, and I want to read this exactly as it appears in the court transcript. "You murdered a young woman. You then concealed her remains in your father's garden, a man who had done nothing but love you, and you visited that garden, stood over that ground, and allowed him to tend it in ignorance for 3 years. The cruelty of that act toward your father is, in its own way, almost as difficult to comprehend as the murder itself." Thomas looked at the floor. He has not spoken publicly since. His father has since sold the house. He told a family member, according to reporting in the Shropshire Star, "I can't look at a garden now, any garden. I'll never garden again." The Kayla Mathers case contains several specific warning patterns that the National Crime Agency and domestic abuse charities now use in professional training materials. First, the isolation pattern. In the 18 months before her disappearance, Kayla had progressively reduced contact with friends and family. This is a documented behavioral marker of coercive control, not a sign that a person is unsettled or choosing to withdraw, but a sign that someone may be managing and limiting their relationships under duress. Second, the statement of fear. Kayla's mother reported that Kayla had told her she was scared. That statement, made to police and recorded in writing, should have triggered a formal risk assessment. It did not. If you report a missing person and you provide a specific allegation of fear relating to a named individual, you have the right to ask whether a risk assessment has been completed. You have the right to request escalation. Third, the use of the victim's communication channels after disappearance. Thomas used Kayla's phone after her death. This pattern, a perpetrator maintaining the victim's digital presence to deflect suspicion, is documented in multiple UK homicide cases. If a missing person appears to be communicating normally but the communication feels wrong, the tone is different, the phrasing is unusual, they are actively steering you away from asking questions. Trust that instinct. Report it specifically. If you are concerned about a missing person in the UK, call the police on 101 or missing people on 116,000. If you believe someone is in immediate danger, call 999. There is a concept in forensic psychology called normalcy maintenance, the sustained, deliberate performance of ordinary life by an individual who has committed an act they know to be catastrophic. It is not, as it is sometimes portrayed, evidence of psychopathy or the absence of emotion. Research from the University of Edinburgh's Centre for Forensic and Legal Psychology indicates that normalcy maintenance is most commonly a trauma response, the mind's attempt to contain an unbearable reality by surrounding it with the familiar. Thomas visited his father. He ate at his table. He asked about the garden, whether this was calculated concealment or a form of psychological dissociation, or both, is something that forensic psychiatrists have debated in the context of this case and others like it. What the research does tell us, and this is the part that matters practically, is that external normalcy is not evidence of innocence. A person can appear entirely ordinary, entirely consistent with themselves, entirely unremarkable, while carrying something that would, if you knew it, change everything. The lesson is not to distrust everyone. The lesson is to take statements of fear seriously, to take changes in behavior seriously, to take the absence of a person seriously, even and especially when the official explanation is that they chose to leave. Kayla's mother knew something was wrong from the first day. She said it. She said it in writing. She said it to the police. The system decided she was wrong. She was not wrong. Thomas Hartley is currently serving his sentence at a Category B prison in the West Midlands. He has not appealed his conviction. Gerald sold the house in Shropshire in the summer of 2022. He moved to a flat in a village outside Ludlow. He does not have a garden. Sandra Mathers continues to campaign for reform of missing persons investigation protocols in cases involving domestic abuse indicators. She has given evidence to 2 parliamentary select committees. She has met twice with the Home Secretary's office. She has been told on both occasions that the new guidance, issued in January 2023, 4 years after Kayla disappeared, represents significant progress. She disagrees. She told a journalist from The Guardian in March 2023, "My daughter told someone she was scared. They wrote it down. If they had done one more thing, just one, she might be alive. I don't want progress. I want that to never happen to another family." The Independent Office for Police Conduct investigation into the handling of the original missing persons report remains open. No officer has faced disciplinary proceedings. Kayla Mathers was 29 years old. She worked as a dental nurse. She liked hiking. She had been planning a trip to Scotland with Claire for the following spring. She never made that trip. Her name is on the femicide census. Entry 2018, one of 147 women killed by men in the United Kingdom that year. 147. In 1 year. And somewhere in a database right now, at a police station, in a case management system, on a screen that someone looked at and moved past, there is another statement of fear, written down, unactioned, waiting. How many of those statements are there? That is the question nobody in this case, nobody in any official capacity, has been able to answer. And that silence is the most frightening thing about all of it.